Sarah Martinez had always been told she was too small, too quiet, too soft for anything that mattered. At 23, standing barely 5 feet 2 inches tall with delicate features that made people assume she spent her days arranging flowers rather than pursuing serious goals, she had grown tired of the constant underestimation. Her colleagues at the engineering firm where she worked as a junior analyst would politely smile when she offered suggestions during meetings, then promptly ignore her input in favor of louder, more confident voices belonging to her male counterparts. The frustration had been building for months. Every presentation she prepared was somehow attributed to someone else's brilliance. Every innovative solution she proposed was dismissed as impractical, only to be implemented weeks later when suggested by a senior engineer. Sarah felt invisible in her own life, a ghost haunting the edges of conversations and decisions that should have included her voice. It was this simmering resentment that led her to accept Jake Morrison's invitation to join the company's monthly recreational shooting trip. Jake, a former Navy SEAL who now worked in the firm's security consulting division, had noticed Sarah's quiet intensity and suspected there was more to her than met the eye. When he casually mentioned the shooting range outing during a coffee break, Sarah surprised herself by immediately agreeing to participate. The decision shocked everyone, including Sarah herself. She had never held a firearm, never expressed interest in weapons or military culture, and had always been the type to avoid confrontation of any kind. Her idea of adventure was trying a new hiking trail or attempting a challenging recipe. But something about Jake's matter-of-fact invitation, delivered without the patronizing tone she had grown accustomed to hearing, made her want to prove that she was capable of more than people assumed. The night before the shooting trip, Sarah lay awake researching firearms safety, watching tutorial videos, and reading about proper shooting stances. She wanted to avoid embarrassing herself completely, though she harbored no illusions about suddenly discovering a hidden talent for marksmanship. Her goal was simply to participate without making a fool of herself, to show her colleagues that she was willing to step outside her comfort zone and try new experiences. The shooting range was located 40 minutes outside the city, nestled between rolling hills that provided natural sound barriers for the gunfire. Sarah arrived early, her nerves making it impossible to sleep past dawn. She sat in her compact car in the parking lot, watching as other vehicles began to arrive. She recognized several faces from work, including her supervisor David Chen, who had openly questioned whether the range was an appropriate place for someone of Sarah's disposition. Jake Morrison pulled up in a weathered pickup truck that looked like it had seen action in multiple war zones. He was exactly what Central Casting would order for a former Special Forces operator, tall, broad-shouldered, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings. But, unlike the stereotypical image of a gruff military man, Jake possessed a quiet warmth and an uncanny ability to make people feel comfortable in situations that should have been intimidating. As the group gathered at the range entrance, Sarah noticed the subtle way conversations shifted when she joined them. Voices became slightly louder, explanations became more basic, and protective instincts emerged from men who had never shown any concern for her well-being in the office. Tom Bradley, a senior project manager who had stolen credit for her work on at least 3 occasions, immediately appointed himself as her unofficial guardian for the day. The range instructor, a weathered man named Murphy who had been teaching firearms safety for over 2 decades, went through the standard orientation speech. He covered basic safety protocols, explained the different types of weapons available, and demonstrated proper handling techniques. Sarah absorbed every word, taking mental notes and asking clarifying questions that impressed Murphy with their precision and thoughtfulness. The group started with basic handguns, which seemed logical for beginners. Sarah's first few shots were predictably erratic, her unfamiliarity with the weapon's recoil and report causing her to flinch and pull her shots wide of the target. Her colleagues offered helpful advice with barely concealed condescension, their tone suggesting they were speaking to a child attempting her first bicycle ride. But Sarah was a quick study, and her analytical mind began breaking down the mechanics of accurate shooting. She observed the stance and grip of more experienced shooters, noted the relationship between breathing and trigger control, and adjusted her technique based on the results she was seeing downrange. Within an hour, her shots were beginning to group more consistently, though still far from impressive by any objective standard. It was during the lunch break that Jake made his casual suggestion. The group was discussing various shooting challenges they had heard about, when someone mentioned a legendary feat performed by a famous sniper who had achieved 100 consecutive hits on targets at varying distances. The conversation was typical male bravado, each person claiming they could easily accomplish such a feat given the right equipment and conditions. Sarah listened quietly as the discussion grew more animated, with increasingly outrageous claims being made about personal shooting abilities. She noticed that Jake remained silent throughout the conversation, neither boasting about his own considerable skills nor dismissing the claims of others. When Tom Bradley directly challenged him to demonstrate some of his SEAL training techniques, Jake simply smiled and changed the subject. But Sarah caught something in his expression, a flash of amusement mixed with what might have been disappointment at the casual way military training and combat experience were being treated as entertainment. She found herself wondering what Jake had actually experienced during his service, what challenges he had faced that made civilian shooting ranges seem trivial by comparison. After lunch, Jake approached Sarah as she was preparing to continue practicing with the handgun. Without fanfare, he asked if she would be interested in trying something more challenging. When she expressed curiosity, he led her to a different section of the range where a precision rifle was set up on a stable rest, pointed toward targets at much greater distances than what the group had been using for handgun practice. The rifle was a thing of beauty, a precision instrument that Jake explained had been modified for long-range accuracy. He demonstrated the proper shooting position, explaining how the fundamentals she had been learning with the handgun applied to rifle shooting, but with additional considerations for factors like wind drift and bullet trajectory over extended distances. Sarah's first shots with the rifle were revealing in a way that surprised everyone, including herself. While her handgun marksmanship had been adequate for a beginner, something about the rifle felt different. The longer sight radius, the stable shooting position, and the precision required for accurate long-range shooting seemed to complement her analytical nature and steady hands in ways that the more instinctive handgun shooting had not. Her initial groups were tight enough to draw Jake's attention, and he began offering more advanced instruction, teaching her about reading wind conditions, adjusting for different distances, and maintaining consistent form shot after shot. Sarah absorbed the information eagerly, treating each shot as a problem to be solved rather than a test to be passed. As word spread through the group about Sarah's unexpected aptitude with the precision rifle, her colleagues began gathering to watch. The casual conversations and joking around gradually gave way to genuine interest as Sarah's shots continued to find their marks with increasing consistency. What had started as a curiosity was beginning to look like genuine talent. Tom Bradley, perhaps sensing that his assumptions about Sarah were being challenged, began making subtle comments about beginner's luck and the advantages of using a precision weapon with a stable rest. His tone carried the familiar condescension that Sarah had learned to ignore in professional settings, but something about the context made his words sting more sharply than usual. Jake noticed the undercurrent of dismissiveness in Tom's comments and seemed to be considering something. He watched Sarah fire another series of shots, all of which struck close to the center of the target at 200 yards. When she looked up from the scope with a mixture of surprise and satisfaction at her performance, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He suggested a challenge that went beyond the casual shooting the group had been doing. If Sarah was interested, he would set up a series of targets at different distances and positions, creating a course of fire that would test not just accuracy, but consistency under pressure. The challenge would be to achieve 100 consecutive hits without a miss, something that would require sustained concentration and flawless execution over an extended period. The suggestion was met with skeptical laughter from most of the group. The idea that Sarah, who had never held a rifle before that day, could achieve something that would challenge experienced shooters seemed absurd to everyone except Jake. But Sarah looked at the rifle in her hands, thought about all the times she had been dismissed and underestimated, and heard herself accepting the challenge before she had fully processed what she was agreeing to attempt. The transformation in group dynamics was immediate and telling. What had been a casual recreational outing suddenly had stakes, and Sarah found herself at the center of attention in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Some of her colleagues were openly betting against her success, while others seemed genuinely interested in seeing how far she could push her newly discovered abilities. As Jake began setting up targets at various distances, explaining the course of fire and the rules that would govern the challenge, Sarah felt a familiar surge of determination. It was the same feeling she experienced when facing a particularly complex engineering problem or when preparing for a presentation that she knew would be scrutinized more harshly than those given by her male colleagues. The difference was that this time, success or failure would be measured objectively. There would be no subjective evaluations, no credit stolen by others, no dismissal of her contributions. Each shot would either hit the target or miss, and the cumulative result would speak for itself in a language that even her most condescending colleagues would be forced to acknowledge. Sarah checked the rifle one more time, adjusting the scope and settling into the shooting position that Jake had taught her. The first target was positioned at 100 yards, a distance that had seemed impossible when she arrived at the range that morning but now felt manageable given her rapid improvement throughout the day. As she prepared to take the first shot of what would either be a spectacular failure or an unprecedented achievement, Sarah realized that she was no longer thinking about proving anything to her colleagues. The challenge had become something personal, a test of her own capabilities and determination that transcended the opinions of others. The range fell silent as she controlled her breathing, aligned the crosshairs with the center of the distant target, and began the slow, steady pressure on the trigger that would determine whether her journey toward 100 consecutive hits would begin with success or end before it truly started. The shot broke cleanly, and Sarah watched through the scope as the bullet struck exactly where she had aimed. 1 down, 99 to go. But, as she cycled the bolt and prepared for the second shot, Sarah Martinez was no longer the same person who had arrived at the range that morning feeling invisible and underestimated. She had found something she didn't know she was looking for, and, regardless of what happened over the next 99 shots, everything had already changed. The quiet woman who had spent years being overlooked and dismissed was about to discover just how loud silence could be when delivered through the barrel of a precision rifle, one perfect shot at a time. The challenge was no longer about borrowing someone else's rifle to prove a point. It had become about finding her own voice in a language she was only beginning to understand, but one in which she seemed to be naturally fluent. And that realization was perhaps more powerful than any target she could hit or any record she might set. Sarah's second shot struck the target center, confirming that the first hadn't been pure luck. The small crowd of colleagues who had gathered to witness what they expected to be a brief embarrassment began to shift their weight and exchange glances. Tom Bradley's confident smirk remained in place, but his arms crossed defensively across his chest as he watched Sarah methodically work the bolt action and settle back into her shooting position. Jake Morrison stood slightly apart from the group, his expression unreadable as he observed both Sarah's technique and the reactions of her colleagues. His experienced eye could see details that escaped the others. Sarah's breathing was controlled and rhythmic, her grip consistent, and, most importantly, she was treating each shot as an individual event rather than getting ahead of herself by thinking about the enormous task ahead. The third target was positioned at 150 yards, requiring a slight adjustment to her point of aim. Jake had briefed her on the basics of trajectory and holdover, but this was her first practical application of the concepts. Sarah took extra time studying the target through the scope, mentally calculating the adjustment needed based on Jake's earlier instruction. When the shot broke, it struck slightly high but well within the scoring rings. Hit number 3. The group's casual chatter began to quiet as the reality of what Sarah was attempting started to sink in. 100 consecutive hits wasn't just a number thrown around for bragging rights. It represented a level of consistency that would challenge shooters with years of experience. David Chen, her supervisor, moved closer to get a better view of the target downrange. In all his years of knowing Sarah, he had never seen her display anything approaching athletic ability or competitive fire. She was competent at her job, reliable and thorough, but he would never have described her as someone who thrived under pressure. Yet here she was, calmly working through a challenge that was drawing curious looks from other shooters at the range. Shot 4 found its mark at the 150-yard target. Shot 5 moved to a target at 75 yards, an easier distance but one that required Sarah to make another scope adjustment and adapt to the different sight picture. The bullet struck dead center, earning a low whistle of appreciation from Murphy, the range instructor, who had wandered over to observe the proceedings. "That girl's got natural form," Murphy commented to Jake in a voice just loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Don't see beginners pick up fundamentals that fast very often. She's treating each shot like it matters, not rushing or getting excited." That's the difference between someone who can shoot and someone who can really shoot. Sarah heard the praise but forced herself not to react to it. She was beginning to understand that her biggest enemy in this challenge would be her own mind. The moment she started thinking about the praise, the pressure, or the growing number of successful shots behind her, she would lose the focus that was making those shots possible in the first place. Target 6 was back at 100 yards, but positioned at a different angle that required her to adjust her body position slightly. Sarah took her time settling into the new position, ensuring that her bone structure was supporting the rifle rather than relying on muscle tension that would introduce tremors over time. The shot was another center hit, bringing her total to 6 consecutive successes. By the 10th shot, word was spreading throughout the range. Other shooting groups were finishing their own activities and drifting over to watch the unusual spectacle of a slight young woman attempting something that most of them wouldn't have tried themselves. Sarah became aware of the growing audience but made a conscious decision to treat them as background noise, no different from the sounds of other shooters engaging targets at different parts of the facility. Tom Bradley's commentary was becoming more frequent and less subtle. "She's got to miss eventually," he said loudly enough to be heard over the ear protection everyone was wearing. "Nobody shoots perfect, especially not on their first day. The pressure's going to get to her." His words carried the tone of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Shot 15 was at 200 yards, the longest distance Sarah had attempted during her practice session. The target looked impossibly small through the scope, and she found herself second-guessing her holdover calculation. But Jake had positioned himself where he could see her face, and, when he noticed her hesitation, he offered a subtle nod of encouragement that somehow conveyed more confidence than a lengthy pep talk could have provided. The bullet struck the outer edge of the scoring ring, a hit by any reasonable standard but not the precise center shot she had been achieving at closer ranges. For a moment, Sarah felt a flicker of disappointment, but she quickly reminded herself that perfection wasn't the goal. The challenge was 100 hits, not 100 perfect shots. As she moved into the 20s, Sarah began to understand why Jake had chosen this particular challenge. It wasn't just about marksmanship. The mental discipline required to maintain focus shot after shot, to not let success breed overconfidence or minor imperfections create doubt, was teaching her something about herself that went far beyond shooting skills. Shot 20 came at 125 yards, a distance that split the difference between easy and challenging. Sarah's form was becoming more automatic, her pre-shot routine developing into a smooth sequence that helped maintain consistency. She was learning to trust the process rather than trying to control every variable, a lesson that resonated with her engineering background but felt revolutionary in its application. The crowd was no longer casual. Conversations had stopped entirely, and even shooters at other parts of the range were pausing between their own shots to check on Sarah's progress. Murphy had taken it upon himself to call out her hit count after each successful shot, his voice carrying across the range with professional authority that added weight to her achievement. 21, Murphy announced as another bullet found its target. 22. 23. Each number seemed to hang in the air, building momentum towards something that was beginning to feel possible rather than merely hopeful. Sarah was entering a mental state that athletes sometimes describe as the zone, where conscious thought gave way to trained instinct and external distractions faded into irrelevance. Her breathing, grip, sight alignment, and trigger control had synchronized into a rhythm that felt as natural as walking. She was no longer thinking about individual shots but simply executing a process that was producing consistent results. Shot 24 required her to engage a target at an odd angle, positioned to simulate real-world shooting conditions rather than the perfect perpendicular presentations typically used for practice. The challenge forced her to think about wind drift and how the angled target would affect her point of impact. After a moment's calculation, she held slightly to compensate and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck just left of center, a solid hit that brought the count to 24. As she prepared for shot 25, Sarah realized that she had unknowingly reached a milestone. 25 consecutive hits represented a level of performance that would be respectable for any shooter, regardless of experience level. She had already exceeded what anyone could reasonably have expected from her first day at a shooting range. But, rather than feeling satisfied with her achievement, Sarah found herself hungry for more. The dismissive comments from her colleagues, the years of being overlooked and underestimated had created a reservoir of determination that each successful shot was tapping into more deeply. She wasn't shooting to impress anyone anymore. She was shooting to discover the limits of her own capabilities. The 25th target was positioned at 100 yards, a distance that now felt routine despite having been intimidating just hours earlier. Sarah settled into her position with the fluid efficiency that comes from successful repetition, aligned her crosshairs with practiced precision, and controlled her breathing in the rhythm she had established. The shot broke cleanly, and the bullet struck the target with an accuracy that was becoming expected rather than surprising. 25, Murphy called out, his voice carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there at the beginning of the challenge. Tom Bradley had stopped making his deprecating comments, though his expression suggested he was still waiting for the inevitable failure that would validate his assumptions about Sarah's limitations. David Shen was looking at his junior analyst with an expression of genuine puzzlement, as if he were seeing her for the first time despite having worked with her for over 2 years. Jake Morrison allowed himself a small smile as he watched Sarah prepare for shot 26. His instinct about her hidden potential was being validated in dramatic fashion, but, more importantly, he could see that Sarah was discovering something about herself that went far beyond marksmanship. She was learning that she possessed reserves of mental toughness and competitive fire that she had never been called upon to demonstrate before. As Sarah checked the rifle's function and prepared to continue toward the halfway point of her challenge, she felt a sense of momentum building. The first 25 shots had been about proving she belonged at the range. The next 25 would be about proving she belonged anywhere she chose to be. The quiet woman who had arrived that morning convinced she was invisible was discovering that sometimes the most powerful presence comes not from making noise, but from the absolute silence that follows perfect execution. And, with 75 shots still ahead of her, Sarah Martinez was just beginning to understand how loud that silence could become. The rifle felt like an extension of herself now, and the targets downrange were no longer intimidating obstacles but simply the next step in a journey of self-discovery that was teaching her to hit more than she had ever imagined possible. Each shot was reshaping not just her marksmanship skills, but her understanding of her own potential. Shot 26 began the second quarter of Sarah's unprecedented challenge, and with it came a shift in both the atmosphere at the range and Sarah's own mental state. The novelty of watching a beginner shoot accurately had evolved into genuine fascination as observers began to realize they might be witnessing something truly remarkable. Murphy had quietly called over several other range instructors, and word was spreading beyond the immediate group of Sarah's colleagues. The target for shot 26 was positioned at a challenging 180 yards, requiring Sarah to make precise adjustments to her scope settings and account for the slight crosswind that had begun picking up as the afternoon progressed. She had been shooting for nearly 2 hours without a break, and Jake was watching carefully for signs of fatigue that might affect her consistency. Sarah lined up the shot with the methodical precision that had characterized her entire performance, but, as she settled into her final aiming position, she felt something different. For the first time since beginning the challenge, she was acutely aware of the number of successful shots behind her and the weight of expectations that had built around her performance. The mental zone she had inhabited was beginning to crack under the pressure of success itself. The shot broke after what seemed like an eternity of hesitation, and the bullet struck the target off-center, barely catching the edge of the scoring ring. It was a hit by the rules Jake had established, but Sarah knew immediately that something had changed. The unconscious confidence that had carried her through the first 25 shots had been replaced by conscious thought, and, with it came doubt. 26, Murphy announced, but his voice carried a note of concern that hadn't been there before. The experienced instructor had seen this moment countless times with promising shooters. The point where early success created pressure that interfered with the natural ability that had made success possible in the first place. Jake moved closer to Sarah's shooting position, ostensibly to check her target but actually to gauge her mental state. He could see the tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there minutes earlier, the slight tremor in her hands that suggested she was fighting the rifle rather than working with it. "Take a break," he suggested quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced pressure situations that made a shooting range challenge seem trivial by comparison. "Hydrate, stretch, clear your head. The targets aren't going anywhere." Sarah wanted to refuse, afraid that stopping would break whatever spell had been responsible for her success. But the wisdom of Jake's suggestion was obvious even to her. She was holding the rifle with white knuckles, her breathing had become shallow and irregular, and she could feel the weight of every pair of eyes watching her performance. As she stepped back from the firing line, Tom Bradley saw his opportunity to reassert his narrative of inevitable failure. "Pressure's getting to her now," he said with obvious satisfaction. 26 is actually pretty impressive for a beginner, but this is where reality sets in. The next 74 shots are going to be a lot harder when you're thinking about every single one." His words stung because Sarah recognized the truth in them. She had been thinking about every shot, calculating the growing tally, imagining the reactions of her colleagues, and planning what she would say when she inevitably missed. The pure focus that had characterized her first 25 shots had been contaminated by self-consciousness and fear. Jake handed her a bottle of water and guided her away from the immediate crowd to a quiet corner of the range. His expression was thoughtful rather than concerned, as if he were working through a tactical problem that had multiple possible solutions. "You know what's happening, don't you?" he asked without preamble. "You started thinking about the result instead of the process. Success is harder to handle than failure sometimes, especially when you're not used to it." Sarah nodded, taking a long drink of water and trying to relax muscles that had become rigid with tension. "I don't know how to handle people watching me succeed," she admitted. "I'm used to being ignored or written off. This level of attention is harder to deal with than I expected." Jake's smile was understanding. "In combat, we called it target fixation. When you focus so hard on what you're trying to hit that you lose track of everything else, including the fundamentals that would actually help you hit it. The cure is to go back to basics and trust your training." "But I don't have training," Sarah protested. "This is my first day shooting. Everything I know about rifles I learned from you in the past 2 hours." "That's not true," Jake replied firmly. "You have training in concentration, in problem solving under pressure, in maintaining quality standards over extended periods. That's what you do every day in your engineering work. Shooting is just the delivery method, but the mental skills are transferable." Sarah considered his words while watching other shooters engage their own targets. She noticed that the most successful ones seemed relaxed and methodical, treating each shot as an individual event rather than part of a larger performance. They weren't fighting their equipment or rushing through their routine. They simply executed the same process repeatedly until it became automatic. When she returned to the firing line 15 minutes later, Sarah made a conscious decision to ignore everything except the next shot. Not the shot after that, not the growing tally of successful hits, not the crowd of observers, not Tom Bradley's skeptical commentary. Just the immediate task of putting one bullet exactly where she intended it to go. Shot 27 was at 100 yards, a distance that should have felt routine by now. Sarah settled into her position with deliberate slowness, forcing herself to feel the rifle settle into her shoulder, to align the scope with careful precision, to control her breathing in the rhythm that had worked so well earlier. When the shot broke, it struck dead center, the first perfect hit she had achieved in several rounds. 27, Murphy called out, and Sarah thought she heard relief in his voice. The observers seemed to collectively exhale, as if they had been holding their breath waiting to see whether the break had restored her form or confirmed her decline. The next 5 shots rebuilt her confidence gradually. Each successful hit reminded her body and mind of the feeling of correct execution, reinforcing the process that had made her successful. By shot 30, she was beginning to recapture the mental state that had characterized her early performance, though she remained more aware of the effort required to maintain it. Shot 35 came at 200 yards, the distance that had given her the most difficulty during her warm-up period. This time, however, she approached it with the accumulated experience of nearly 3 dozen successful shots behind her. The holdover calculation felt natural, the sight picture looked familiar, and, when the bullet struck well within the scoring ring, Sarah felt a surge of confidence that was more sustainable than the unconscious certainty she had experienced earlier. The crowd had grown substantially. Word was spreading through social media and phone calls, bringing curious shooters from other ranges and even some local media representatives who had heard about the unusual challenge taking place. Sarah was vaguely aware of the increased attention but found it less distracting now that she had learned to narrow her focus to the immediate task at hand. By shot 40, she had established a new rhythm that incorporated the lessons learned during her midpoint crisis. She took slightly longer between shots, used a more deliberate pre-shot routine, and made a conscious effort to treat each target as the first rather than thinking about it as part of a sequence. The approach was sustainable in a way that her earlier unconscious performance might not have been. Tom Bradley's commentary had shifted from predictions of failure to grudging acknowledgement of competence, though he maintained that the challenge would become exponentially more difficult as the pressure mounted in the final stages. 40 shots is impressive, he conceded, but the last 20 are going to be brutal. That's when your hands start shaking and every little mistake gets magnified. Sarah heard his words but found that they had lost their power to create anxiety. She was learning to separate external noise from internal focus, a skill that was serving her well both at the shooting range and in her broader understanding of her own capabilities. Jake watched her progress with growing admiration. He had seen many talented shooters in his military career, but few who possessed Sarah's ability to adapt and learn under pressure. Her willingness to acknowledge her limitations, accept coaching, and modify her approach when necessary demonstrated a level of mental maturity that was rare among competitive athletes, let alone recreational shooters attempting their first major challenge. As Sarah prepared for shot 45, she paused to consider how far she had come from the uncertain, overlooked woman who had arrived at the range that morning. The rifle in her hands no longer felt foreign or intimidating. The targets downrange were no longer obstacles to be overcome but simply the next step in a process she was beginning to master. The transformation was visible to everyone present. Her posture exuded quiet confidence, her movements were efficient and purposeful, and her focus was so intense that she seemed to exist in a bubble of concentration that external distractions couldn't penetrate. Shot 45 struck its target with authority, and, as Murphy announced 45, the number seemed to hang in the air with special significance. Sarah had passed the midpoint of her challenge and emerged stronger rather than weaker from the crisis that had threatened to derail her performance. With 55 shots remaining, she was no longer the same person who had borrowed a stranger's rifle to prove a point to dismissive colleagues. She had become someone who understood that the most important competition was not with others, but with her own limitations and assumptions about what she was capable of achieving. The second half of her challenge would test different aspects of her character, but Sarah Martinez had discovered that she possessed reserves of determination and mental toughness that ran deeper than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. And that discovery was worth more than any number of consecutive hits, though she intended to claim those as well. Shot 50 marked more than just the halfway point of Sarah's challenge. It represented a transformation in how everyone at the range, including Sarah herself, viewed what was unfolding. What had begun as a casual dare had evolved into something approaching a sporting event, with observers tracking her progress and offering quiet encouragement between shots. The local news crew that had arrived was setting up cameras at a respectful distance, having been briefed by Murphy about maintaining range safety while documenting what might become a remarkable story. Sarah had settled into a sustainable rhythm that balanced speed with precision. Each shot was preceded by the same methodical routine: check wind conditions, verify target distance, settle into shooting position, control breathing, align sight picture, and execute a smooth trigger pull. The process had become meditative in its repetition, creating a zone of calm focus that insulated her from external pressures. Target 51 was positioned at a challenging angle and distance that required her to demonstrate the full range of skills she had developed throughout the afternoon. At 160 yards and offset to simulate a realistic field shot, it demanded precise calculations for both distance and wind drift. Sarah took extra time with her setup, feeling the weight of expectation but refusing to let it rush her preparation. The shot broke cleanly and struck within the scoring ring, though not with the precision of her best efforts. It was a workmanlike hit that demonstrated competence rather than brilliance, and Sarah found herself satisfied with that level of performance. She was learning that consistency mattered more than perfection, that managing pressure was as important as technical skill. Jake had positioned himself where he could observe both Sarah's shooting and the reactions of her colleagues. Tom Bradley had fallen silent, his earlier predictions of inevitable failure looking increasingly foolish as the hit count climbed steadily higher. David Chen was taking notes on his phone, as if trying to document something he might need to reference later when evaluating Sarah's potential for increased responsibilities at work. By shot 60, Sarah had been shooting for over 3 hours with only brief breaks for water and equipment adjustments. Physical fatigue was beginning to affect her performance in subtle ways. Her groups were opening up slightly, and she was taking longer to settle into each shooting position. Jake noticed the signs and began considering whether to suggest another break, but Sarah's determination to maintain momentum was obvious. 60, Murphy announced after another successful hit. The number carried special weight because it represented a level of sustained performance that challenged even experienced shooters. Achieving 60 consecutive hits required not just skill but stamina, mental discipline, and the ability to maintain standards under increasing pressure. The crowd had organized itself into an informal cheering section, with people taking turns spotting targets and calling out encouragement between shots. Sarah was dimly aware of their support but found that her focus had narrowed to such a degree that external voices seemed to come from very far away. She existed in a bubble of concentration where only the rifle, the target, and the immediate shot mattered. Shot 65 came at a moment when Sarah's confidence was at its peak. She had strung together 15 consecutive hits since her midpoint crisis, and the process felt automatic rather than effortful. The target was at a comfortable 125 yards, the wind was calm, and her shooting position felt perfectly stable. But, as she settled behind the scope, Sarah experienced a moment of profound clarity about what she was attempting to achieve. This wasn't just about proving her competence to dismissive colleagues or even about setting some kind of record. It was about discovering the outer boundaries of her own capabilities, about learning what became possible when she refused to accept other people's limitations of her potential. The realization was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. If she could achieve something this extraordinary in an activity she had never tried before, what other capabilities had she left unexplored? What other assumptions about her limitations were equally unfounded? The shot struck dead center, earning a spontaneous cheer from the assembled crowd. 65, Murphy called out, his voice carrying pride that went beyond professional interest. He had been teaching shooting for decades, but he had never seen a novice display this level of mental toughness and sustained performance. As Sarah prepared for shot 66, she became aware that her success was having an impact beyond her own personal development. Other shooters at the range were pausing their own activities to watch her progress, and she overheard conversations about technique and mental approach that suggested her performance was influencing how others thought about their own shooting. The next 10 shots tested her ability to maintain form under increasing pressure. Each successful hit brought her closer to an achievement that was beginning to seem genuinely possible, but also increased the weight of expectation. Missing at shot 75 would be far more disappointing than missing at shot 25, and Sarah could feel that psychological burden affecting her preparation routine. Jake sensed her struggle and moved closer to the firing line. Without disrupting her concentration, he positioned himself where she could see him in her peripheral vision, a calming presence that reminded her she wasn't facing this challenge alone. His silent support helped her refocus on the process rather than the outcome, returning her to the mental state that had made her early success possible. Shot 75 struck its target with authority, bringing her 3/4 of the way to her goal. The significance of the moment was lost on no one present, including Sarah herself. She had achieved something that would have seemed impossible when she woke up that morning, and she had 25 shots remaining to complete a feat that would be remarkable for any shooter regardless of experience level. Tom Bradley approached the firing line during Sarah's brief rest between shots. His earlier antagonism had been replaced by something approaching respect, though his competitive nature still made it difficult for him to fully acknowledge what he was witnessing. "I have to admit, I didn't think you had this in you," he said, his tone more thoughtful than condescending. 75 straight hits is legitimate shooting, especially under this kind of pressure. You've already proven whatever point you were trying to make. Sarah looked at him with an expression that was calm but determined. "I wasn't trying to prove anything to you," she replied quietly. "I was trying to find out what I was capable of. And I'm not done yet." Her response silenced Tom and seemed to crystallize something for the other observers. This had never been about external validation or proving critics wrong. It was about self-discovery, about pushing beyond assumed limitations to find out what became possible with sustained effort and mental discipline. The targets for shots 76 through 80 were positioned at varying distances and angles, creating a demanding sequence that would test Sarah's ability to adapt quickly while maintaining accuracy. She approached each one with the same methodical preparation, refusing to let the mounting pressure of approaching her goal rush her through the fundamentals that had brought her this far. Shot 78 required her to engage a target at the maximum distance of 200 yards while compensating for a crosswind that had been building throughout the afternoon. The calculations were complex enough to challenge her mathematical skills as well as her marksmanship, but Sarah approached the problem with the same analytical mindset she brought to engineering challenges at work. The bullet struck slightly left of center, a solid hit that demonstrated her ability to make accurate adjustments under challenging conditions. As Murphy announced 78, Sarah felt a surge of confidence that was different from her earlier emotional highs and lows. This was the quiet certainty that came from accumulated competence rather than momentary inspiration. With 22 shots remaining, Sarah paused to consider the magnitude of what she was attempting to complete. 100 consecutive hits represented more than just marksmanship. It demonstrated sustained excellence under pressure, the ability to learn and adapt rapidly, and the mental toughness to perform at a high level when failure would be public and disappointing. But, more than any of those qualities, it represented a fundamental shift in how Sarah Martinez saw herself. The woman preparing for shot 79 was not the same person who had hesitantly accepted Jake's invitation to try something new. She had discovered capabilities she didn't know she possessed and developed confidence that extended far beyond the shooting range. As she settled into position for the next shot, Sarah realized that regardless of what happened in the final 21 attempts, she had already achieved something extraordinary. She had silenced her doubters, but, more importantly, she had silenced the voice of doubt within herself. The rifle felt like an extension of her will now, and the targets downrange were no longer obstacles but simply the next steps in a journey of self-discovery that was teaching her to aim higher than she had ever thought possible. With each successful shot, she was hitting more than targets. She was hitting assumptions, limitations, and the invisible barriers that had kept her potential locked away. 21 shots remained, but Sarah Martinez had already found what she was looking for. Now she was going to finish what she had started, not for the crowd or the critics or the cameras, but for the woman she was discovering herself to be. Shot 79 marked the beginning of the final act in Sarah's extraordinary performance, and with it came a level of tension that was palpable throughout the range. Word had spread beyond the shooting facility, bringing curious onlookers, local reporters, and even some competitive shooters from nearby clubs who wanted to witness what was being described as an unprecedented display of beginner's skill and mental fortitude. Sarah was acutely aware of the growing crowd but had learned to channel external pressure into internal focus. Each additional observer represented another person who believed she might achieve something remarkable, and she found their faith more motivating than intimidating. The nervous energy that had threatened to derail her performance at the midpoint had been transformed into sustained determination. The target for shot 79 was positioned at 140 yards, a distance that required precise scope adjustment and careful attention to wind conditions that had been shifting throughout the late afternoon. Sarah took extra time with her preparation, double-checking her calculations and ensuring that her shooting position was perfectly stable before committing to the shot. When the trigger broke, the recoil felt familiar and controlled, and Sarah watched through the scope as the bullet struck exactly where she had aimed. The hit was clean and confident, earning enthusiastic applause from the assembled crowd. 79, Murphy announced, his voice carrying the gravity of someone documenting history in the making. Jake Morrison moved closer to the firing line, positioning himself where he could observe Sarah's mental state as she entered the most challenging phase of her attempt. In his military experience, he had seen many soldiers perform brilliantly under pressure until the moment when success seemed within reach, only to falter when the weight of expectation became overwhelming. But Sarah showed no signs of the anxiety or overconfidence that typically derailed performance in crucial moments. Her pre-shot routine remained methodical and thorough, her breathing stayed controlled and rhythmic, and her focus seemed to intensify rather than waver as the stakes increased. Shot 80 engaged a target at 100 yards, a distance that had become routine over the course of the afternoon. But Sarah treated it with the same careful attention she had given to the most challenging shots, refusing to let familiarity breed complacency. The bullet struck with precision that demonstrated her complete mastery of the fundamentals, bringing her count to 80 consecutive hits. The significance of reaching 80 hits was not lost on anyone present. Sarah had achieved a level of sustained performance that would be impressive for any shooter, regardless of experience. She had proven that her early success wasn't beginner's luck, that her midpoint recovery wasn't a fluke, and that her current string of hits represented genuine skill development rather than temporary inspiration. Tom Bradley, who had spent much of the day predicting Sarah's failure, was now taking pictures with his phone and posting updates on social media. His transformation from skeptic to supporter reflected the broader change in how everyone at the range viewed Sarah's capabilities and potential. David Chen was having his own moment of recognition about his junior analyst. The quiet competence and analytical thinking that made Sarah valuable in engineering applications were the same qualities that had enabled her to master precision shooting in a single afternoon. He was beginning to understand that he had been significantly underestimating her potential for leadership and increased responsibilities. Shots 81 through 85 created a rhythm of success that felt almost inevitable. Each target presented its own challenges in terms of distance, angle, or environmental conditions, but Sarah's approach remained consistent: careful preparation, precise execution, and immediate refocus on the next shot without dwelling on success or failure. By shot 85, Sarah had been shooting for nearly 4 hours with only brief breaks. Physical fatigue was becoming a factor, but her mental state remained sharp and focused. She had learned to manage her energy efficiently, using the time between shots to maintain alertness while conserving the concentration required for accurate shooting. The crowd had grown to include families with children who had come to watch what local media was calling an inspiring display of determination and skill. Sarah was dimly aware of their presence but found that her focus had narrowed to such a degree that external distractions simply didn't register in her consciousness. Shot 86 came at a moment when Sarah experienced perfect clarity about her technique and mental approach. Everything felt synchronized: her breathing, her sight picture, her trigger control, and her mental state. The shot broke with textbook precision and struck dead center, earning the most enthusiastic response from the crowd yet. Jake watched Sarah's performance with growing amazement. In his military career, he had trained with some of the world's most skilled marksmen, but he had rarely seen anyone demonstrate such rapid skill development combined with sustained mental discipline. Sarah possessed something that couldn't be taught: the ability to maintain peak performance under increasing pressure. As Sarah prepared for shot 90, she took a longer break than usual to hydrate and stretch muscles that were beginning to protest after hours of sustained shooting. Jake approached during her rest period, offering quiet encouragement and technical advice about managing fatigue in the final stages of her attempt. "You're doing something extraordinary," he told her, his tone carrying the respect of one professional recognizing exceptional performance in another. 10 more shots and you'll have achieved something that most shooters can only dream about. Stay focused on the process, trust your training, and don't let the magnitude of the moment change what's been working for you." Sarah nodded, feeling grateful for his support but also recognizing that the confidence to complete her challenge had to come from within. She had already proven to herself that she could perform under pressure, adapt to new situations, and sustain excellence over extended periods. The final 10 shots would simply be confirmation of capabilities she had already demonstrated. Shot 90 engaged a target at 160 yards, requiring calculations that had become second nature over the course of her performance. Sarah's movements were efficient and purposeful, her preparation thorough but not rushed, her execution clean and confident. The bullet struck within the scoring ring, bringing her to within 10 shots of her goal. 90, Murphy announced, and the single word seemed to electrify the crowd. Sarah had reached a milestone that made her ultimate success seem genuinely possible rather than merely hopeful. The final 10 shots would test her ability to maintain form when the pressure was at its peak, but she had already demonstrated the mental toughness required to succeed. The next 5 shots created a crescendo of tension and excitement. Each successful hit brought Sarah closer to her goal while simultaneously increasing the weight of expectation. The crowd fell silent between shots, holding their collective breath as they watched her prepare and execute each attempt. Shot 95 struck its target with authority, earning spontaneous applause that Sarah barely heard. she existed in a bubble of concentration where only the immediate task mattered, where the rifle and target were the entire universe, and where the next shot was the only thing worthy of consideration. With 5 shots remaining, Sarah paused to acknowledge the magnitude of what she was about to complete. 100 consecutive hits would represent more than just marksmanship. It would demonstrate that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they refused to accept limitations imposed by others or themselves. Shots 96, 97, and 98 each found their targets with the consistency that had characterized Sarah's entire performance. The crowd was no longer just watching, they were participating in something special, witnessing a demonstration of human potential that transcended the specific activity taking place. As Sarah prepared for shot 99, the range fell completely silent. Even other shooting activities had stopped as word spread about what was happening. Sarah settled into her shooting position with the calm confidence that had carried her this far, aligned her crosshairs with familiar precision, and controlled her breathing in the rhythm that had become natural. The shot broke cleanly and struck the target dead center, the best hit she had made all day. 99, Murphy called out, and his voice carried emotion that professional composure couldn't completely conceal. 1 shot remained. Sarah had exceeded every expectation, challenged every assumption, and proven that extraordinary achievement was possible when determination met opportunity. But the final shot carried the weight of completing something perfect, of achieving a goal that would stand as testament to what she was capable of accomplishing. As she prepared for shot 100, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started the day invisible and underestimated, convinced that her contributions didn't matter and her potential was limited. She was about to finish it as someone who had achieved something remarkable through skill, determination, and the willingness to challenge her own assumptions about what was possible. The final target was positioned at 100 yards, the same distance as her very first shot. The symmetry felt appropriate, bringing her full circle to where the challenge had begun. Sarah settled into her shooting position one final time, feeling the weight of everyone's hopes and expectations, but also feeling the quiet confidence that came from knowing she had already succeeded in ways that transcended any specific number of consecutive hits. She aligned her crosshairs with the center of the target, controlled her breathing in the rhythm that had become second nature, and applied steady pressure to the trigger. The shot broke with perfect clarity, and Sarah watched through the scope as the bullet struck exactly where she had aimed. 100, Murphy announced, and his voice was nearly drowned out by the eruption of cheers and applause from the crowd. Sarah had achieved something extraordinary, silencing every doubter and proving that remarkable accomplishment was possible when ordinary people refused to accept limitations. But, as she stood and accepted congratulations from the assembled crowd, Sarah Martinez knew that the most important victory wasn't the 100 consecutive hits. It was the discovery that she possessed capability she had never been allowed to demonstrate, potential that had been waiting for the right opportunity to emerge, and the confidence to aim higher than anyone had ever expected. She had borrowed a SEAL's rifle and used it to find her own voice, one perfect shot at a time. And that voice, once discovered, would never be silenced again.